nice. Well, thank you for having us. We're very excited to be presenting to you all today. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I want to try so hard to talk at my normal pace, but I'm trying to slow myself down because we have time to talk today. And I'm very excited to get to know this group a little bit better and make sure that we answer all of your questions. And we have some things that we would really love to share from our perspective on the bench. I do see a couple of people in the chat have gone ahead and put where they're from. If more people could do that, I would love to see who we have joining us. Just let me know what organization you're with or what your role is and how you're interested in kind of the presentation we're doing today. Also, as we're talking, please feel free to drop in questions. I'll be monitoring that and we'll make sure we save some time at the end to answer any questions that we didn't get to. Judge Wheelis, anything you want to say before we start our presentation?
Just good morning. I'm Cindy Wheelis, and as was stated, I'm judge of the 417th District Court. My court hears child welfare, civil trial law, family trial law, and juvenile delinquency cases. Just to get us sort of in the room, when I started analyzing neonatal abstinence syndrome, I was struck by its many ironies and counterintuitive responses. So that's kind of my theme. I also want to say that, in my opinion, which is never to be considered humble, the substance use disorder is the most judged and vilified illness that we really currently have. The brain is, in my opinion, working perfectly in response to what a tough world we live in. So that is all. Back to you, Judge Martinez-Jones.
All right, so let me go ahead and start this presentation so we can get started. Give me just a moment and get myself situated. All right, can you all see my screen? Wonderful, wonderful. All right, so we will go ahead and get started here. We are going to be talking to you all about the best interest of a child and how we are balancing the parent-child relationship and the child welfare cases for parents with substance use disorder. So we got the introduction on the both of us. I do want to say that prior to me taking the bench, we have a family drug treatment court program we're going to talk about a little bit more. But before I took the bench as an associate judge and then later district judge, I was a parent's attorney on that family drug treatment court. So I spent a lot of my time with clients who had substance use disorders who were in the family drug treatment court program. And at one time, our program had a grant where we only took children 5 and under. And so mostly infants. We had a lot of our referrals from the hospitals. I will say that I am a much better judge in how I work with parents with a substance use disorder because I have that experience of being an attorney for a parent with substance use disorder. I learned so much about how that relationship informs someone who's in the legal world on how to help them work through some of the goals that they have for their case, which is a very important thing. And I'm happy to talk about it a little bit more, but I did expand my private practice working with families in the private sector who weren't involved with child welfare, but had, a loved one with substance use disorder. I kind of coined it as a legal life cleanup is what I started specializing in and helping people with substance use disorder who are in recovery. Just a lot of legal issues that are loose ends that needed to be tied up. And I really enjoyed that work. It felt really good to be able to do that even in the private sector. But Judge, was there anything else about your background that you wanted to share? I know you shared just a little bit more a while ago.
I agree with you. It's been a long time, but back in the day, I represented parents and children in CPS cases. And I was always struck with the notion by some other attorneys that they only wanted to be appointed to represent the children. And it rubbed me the wrong way. I thought it was a contradiction in terms because what I'm about to say, in accordance with our title, it is in the best interest of every child to be parented by their own parent where possible. So I think, without getting further into our presentation, I think it should be stated that without that proposition, we will make all sorts of errors in our judgments. And so I'm informed by that it is in the best interest of every child to be with their own parents wherever possible and wherever safe. I do want to say that I'd like to add a little song because, or not singing it, but the.
I was about to say, this is going to be a really special presentation.
No, Judge, you're welcome. I'm not going to sing it. But there was a pop song in 2000 by Creed. And I know there's a lot of, this is a guilty pleasure of mine because Creed is not maybe everyone's taste in rock music, but called Arms Wide Open. And the lyrics are just exquisitely beautiful. And it says this: welcome to this place, I'll show you everything. And then he pivots and says, well, I don't know if I'm ready to be the man I have to be. I think that's every one of our expression and worry and fear when we're pregnant. And then he circles right back to, I'll show you love. And it just expresses the hope in my opinion, with little exception, every parent's wish is to be a good parent. And so we all have to start with that proposition.
Wonderful, thank you. And now I have a known fact about Judge Wheelis, that she likes Creed. Okay, I will save that for a good time that we have with other judges.
Extort me.
All right, and so then one of the things we really wanted to start off talking about, I think y'all heard about it a little bit earlier and perhaps last year, but it's also important to us in the courts, but the plans of safe care. And Judge Wheelis, do you want to start off talking about plans of safe care?
Yes, I am really thinking in the terms of coming from in the trenches. Plans of safe care are rarely seen coming from our medical field providers. Plans of safe care are required by law, and I'm quite sure and confident that they're being given maybe to our child welfare workers, our conservatorship workers at the hospital, but I don't know that they're making it to the courtroom, and it would provide a lot of coverage and a lot of guidance to the court coming from the experts. And I just want to say that planning for safe care of infants with neonatal abstinence syndrome, fortunately, that most every step of best evidence for safe care of that condition, neonatal abstinence syndrome, supports the family or mom as well. And so I just want to say that I'm so excited to see that those two coalesce in, the mom titrating down or onto methadone, or I cannot say the other word, buprenorphine, I'm not sure. You all know it better than I do. Skin to skin contact, breastfeeding, except in certain very, very small cases of exceptions, and then learning how to sue that benefits both mom and child. So win-win.
And so you can see from the slide, we gave you a little bit of information. In 2016, there is child welfare legislation that expands this. And we have the Administration for Children, Youth, and Families, Children's Bureau, and they provide some guidance on there. As judges, one of the things that we do is not know it all, but we have people who know it all come tell us about it. So we have expert testimony in our courts all the time. We get recommendations from professionals in various different fields. It's a wonderful experience to be able to learn something almost every time you have a trial, because new things come up. Each and every family is different and unique, and you get to learn all about it, and you get to learn about new and interesting things. But the point is that we are not the ones that come with the knowledge of the best thing to do. And so as judges, we take a lot of pause when we have a case of family that's coming to us for orders and we don't have some guidance on what those orders need to look like. It's not that we want to come up with them off the top of our head. It's not that we want to come up with something that we think would fit, because we work very hard not to have our own personal thoughts, opinions, biases, all of those things that could not be best for children or culturally responsive for a family to interfere with making sure that the family gets what's needed and what's best for them. So a plan of safe care coming from a medical provider who we would deem as an expert is something that could be extraordinarily beneficial for me as a court, because what I can have is a medical provider who's had service being provided to this family, to this mother, to this infant, having assessed them, having learned what their needs are, be able from their expertise to provide to a court something that says this is the plan for this family. And we oftentimes come to a situation with a family that I wish would have had one, but doesn't. And so then we're turning to the next option in just the way our system has, which is the Department of Family and Protective Services. The department is hardworking and they've got a lot on their shoulders. And unfortunately, they are by no means the expert on this either. They have very strong people who work for them. They're able to gain this information, but once it trickles down to the level of caseworkers and their supervisors in my court, I would not call any of them the experts in this field. It's very difficult to get away from a cookie cutter approach. And what we've known and what we're learning is that cookie cutter approaches are not trauma informed. That's not the way that we're going to help families. And that's what we end up with in child welfare, are service plans. So they're not plans of safe care, they're service plans, and they're come up with through the department. Sometimes we get some recommendations through a psychological evaluation or a drug and alcohol assessment, but usually that comes later. And so we end up having to take so many steps back to try and get engaged with providers to get the recommendations that we could have just got if we had those plans of safe care. One of the things that has been on my to-do list is to create a partnership. I want to start locally, but to create a partnership with our local hospitals and our nurses and social workers at those hospitals to be able to assure that we can work in collaboration to get those plans of safe care from the very beginning. I think with a lot of changes in legislation and health welfare, it's going to be something that's going to be more important as we see that there's been new changes coming to the way that the department is going to be interfering in families and what they are and are not going to be able to do. You can see one of the pieces of guidance is that multi-system collaboration is a best practice to support affected infants and their families. And I want to collaborate in as many spaces as I can. I will admit I've had the Children's Bureau visit my court and visit Austin, Texas on multiple occasions asking about the plans of safe care. And so I am getting the indication that they very much want to assure that the collaborations are occurring. I've had an opportunity working with the PEI, Prevention and Early Intervention arm of the department. And we did a wonderful thing. We were able to go and partner with Colorado. We took a trip out to Colorado, and in Colorado, they are doing amazing things with some partnerships for plans of safe care. I was a little bit jealous, but they had a model about how they were able to assure that they were collaborating with their hospitals and that they were able to make sure that those plans of safe care were occurring more regularly than not. And so I feel very fortunate that I was able to see that. And I feel like I'm coming to a time where I have the capacity. And so my email address will be here at the end of this presentation. Anybody who's involved in that world where we can work together on plans of safe care, please send me an email and let me know you're interested, because I'm very, very excited to move forward that effort that I think we desperately need in Texas.
Agreed. And building on that, Judge Martinez-Jones' collaboration idea, the plans of safe care would probably serve in my court in the trenches here where sausage is being made. I think they would assist maybe our new education and information in this trauma-informed era. It would be in line with but go against some of the old school recommendations that we're still getting. So the inclination is to be judgmental and all of the other biases. And when I was watching the HHSC video on mommies and babies in the program, really struck me as I have a responsibility as the face of justice to the medical field, to these moms and dads and their children, that I not be obstreperous or seen as the obstacle to this wonderful synthesis that's being worked out between families and their infant who are both sick. And the medical profession could go a long way to providing me cover or what is required in our courtroom, which is just practically speaking, evidence. We have to have evidence that counteracts all of the stigma and the prejudice and bias that goes along with these areas of concern.
So we have some of the data, Judge Wheelis, if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Thank you. My wonderful first year law student did some research, and she and I came across this chart, and it's just devastating to see that in a very short time, like this is 2009 to 2015, but her research uncovered from 2006 to 2016, it was just like a 300% increase across the country. Higher rates in areas where unemployment exists, higher rates in poor socioeconomic level conditions. And then just layer on top of that all of the other societal problems that we have, like a shortage of mental health care providers and treatment providers. I think that what we have to do is be intentional, like this symposium, like this NAS Symposium does every year, is intentionally speaking to our frontal lobe, say, hey, the building is still on fire, and if we don't do something, we'll have maternal mortality and also infant mortality at a rate that we don't have to suffer. And so I don't want to read to you what you've seen on the screen, but as you can see, it's very concentrated in primarily rural states. And so all that to say is that no one is off the hook. Every state in all 50 have neonatal abstinence syndrome. And maybe more importantly, substance use disorder is absolutely one of the largest factors of affecting all layers of economics in our country, but more importantly, the human being cost. The human cost is that people are very, very sad and lonely and marginalized, and we, as intentional application, we can make that difference. We can connect them to the help they need.
And I'll say, I thought what was really interesting was kind of this final policy makers, and then looking at economic development as a health intervention. I thought that was so interesting. And as I think about some of my other brothers and sisters on the bench, the thing that I hear about in the rural communities is we don't have the services, we don't have the providers. So we can't even do anything about what we're seeing because we don't have the providers and enough of them to help the people that we need to provide help for. This is a very interesting information. So before we went straight into the bench, we wanted to make sure we took an opportunity to have a discussion about equity, especially when we're talking about this very specific syndrome that's particularly related to the opioid epidemic. We can't not understand that there is a vast difference in the way in which we've seen different substance use disorders treated. As judges, we have been going through a lot of efforts to make sure that we're looking not only at removing our own implicit bias, that we're identifying and eradicating explicit bias, and that we're looking at systemic inequities that cause the situations that we see in our courts. And so I do want to say, and I'll talk a little bit more about some differences that I've seen as it relates to equity in my drug court, but people are treated differently. And we wanted to take the time, and Judge Wheelis was so great. Judge Wheelis, I love presenting with you because as I put this presentation together, and I've been doing nothing but equity work for so much of the pandemic, you said, what about equity? Are we going to talk about it in this presentation? And I love, love, love that you did that because I said, yes, I need to be held accountable for each and every time to be able to discuss it because it is also something that is apparent whenever we start talking about people with substance use disorder, how they are treated in court, how they are treated in the legal case as it relates to the department, how we perceive somebody who, suffers from a substance use disorder or is a drug addict. It's very different just in our language and the culture that we cultivate, what kind of outcomes we can see, because a lot of this is tied to the human element, as Judge Wheeler said earlier. And so, I think people have heard about this. I want to think that a lot of people understand what's happening, but we can look. This was a Columbia Journalism Review article that I saw, very specifically geared to those in the media, saying, let's take a look at what we've been doing. If we compare what we're seeing about the opioid epidemic and compare that to what was going on whenever people were being affected by the use of crack, you can see even in the media the vast differences in which it's portrayed. And we talk about the media, but it's not just the media. This is a snapshot of how our culture treats different people different ways based on a lot of this is systemic racism and institutional reasons why we see these different outcomes. So you see on the left, activists, they're on Capitol Hill, they're talking about the opioid epidemic. You can see that they're portraying their loved ones. And it really stood out to me, this image, because it's somebody who's a loved one that has passed away from drug overdose. And it's this picture of him with these angel wings. And then we have on the other side a picture from the 80s where the US Marshals are conducting a raid on a crack house. And we have the people who are suffering from substance use disorder as well, laying on the ground, face down with guns drawn. That we were treating these people very differently. And the most obvious difference between these two groups are white people who are impacted by the epidemic and Black people who were impacted by the crack epidemic. And so, Judge Willis, if you want to say anything else on the equity note.
Yes. So, and I'll circle back around to some of the contradictions and ironies just with substance use disorder and the varying layers and levels of stigma and prejudice and bias. But as to equity, I follow the juvenile drug court guidelines, and they are slightly different in that every staffing, and we'll describe our response as the justice system to what is known as drug court guidelines and all of that. But to jump the gun just a bit, I had a participant in our group really call out the differences between our language of how we responded as a culture, our entire United States culture response to crack was not called an epidemic. It was called the war on drugs, which became the war on disproportionately African-American males. And then still within that same group of disproportionate impact were African-American females who were, roundly locked up and put away for very long federal sentences. Little known fact that when I did criminal defense law, the state or the government could aggregate 2 mules crack cocaine, which is already in powder form. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but essentially get a almost double sentence under the federal sentencing guidelines. So those of you who think that because we became really aware of how we criminalized possession for users, that we also did not spring them from their prison sentences. So that's for another day and another discussion. But fast forward to our opioid epidemic is what we're calling it. And our response is to have Narcan bring people back to life in all police cars, and treatment and therapeutic intervention. You don't hear much about locking up people who are addicted to opioids. I think it's important to note that at the exact same time, the 80s, where the crack epidemic was affecting probably everyone similarly, but disproportionately impacting in jailing and prosecution African-American persons, that Wall Street was abusing cocaine, pure cocaine, at its highest rates ever, and no one was arrested. I repeat, no one was even arrested. And so I think it is impossible, it's inescapable that that is a racially disproportionate response by our community. I wish that we had had a crack epidemic response. I wouldn't take away our response to the opioid epidemic, because I think that is the right-headed thinking. So not to say I'd change anything currently, but I regret that we can't go back and change our response to the crack epidemic, because in their own way, these substances are in and of themselves addictive. So given the right circumstances, and I just have a personal opinion that these folks are canaries in the coal mine. They're letting us know about the trauma in our community. They're letting us know about the trauma in our culture. They are literally addicted to painkillers. What does that tell you about the state of our society? It is a hard place to be. Escaping reality seems perfectly logical to me. Would it be a good time for me to double back and talk about the stigma?
Yes, and we do have a question, I think, that's really related to what we're talking about.
Go for
It
it.
says, I wonder if the response, as opposed to the 1970s, could possibly have anything to do with the knowledge we have gained in our recovery community and the education we have been able to share with the general public. Maybe advocating for recovery works. And I would say I definitely believe that, with more education and advocacy for recovery, that's absolutely something that I think is positive and has helped. But I have to say that, I'm not that old, and I have been around for only so much. And even when I, as a professional adult, had started getting involved in this work, the stigma is still there. The stigma is very real. And I feel like it's been in much more recent times that we're having this conversation of switching from the idea of a choice to be an addict to a mental health disorder. Like, I still feel like that's still a very new concept, a very big shift in culture that's not 100% accepted across the United States. And I think a big push for that has been the faces of who we see in addiction or with a substance use disorder. And those faces being white people, middle class people, people that I think the white community identifies with more than they have in the past with African American and Hispanic communities, to say, I connect, I see. And what we do know as a fact is that majority of our decision makers, who are our lawmakers and who are in positions of power, are white. And so when they identify and they empathize and they can see how their families and their lives and their constituents are being impacted, that's when we've been able to see substantial change. So I don't think we can discount that piece of it, but I absolutely believe that as we spread the education and that we make sure the general public is aware that this is a mental health disorder, this is an illness that people are suffering from, and we start to think about it that way, that we are better able to help more people across the board, regardless of their race and ethnicity and regardless of their substance use disorder. But that's my thought on it. What about you, Judge Wheelis?
I would agree with Judge Martinez Jones, and I'll go you one further. I'm sort of a cynic, but I'm just delighted that there are providers like the questioner, the person who placed that in the chat. I love the optimistic outlook, but I have to say that I'm old now, and I just have seen enough of people being judgmental, where I'm like, who are you looking at exactly? Who are you seeing when you say such words? Outnumber the, in my opinion, outnumber the idea that recovery has simply gotten better, because frankly, the recovery in the 80s and 90s looks pretty darn similar. And as you all know, in the field, it takes sometimes 7 different inpatient treatments to gather any contiguous sobriety. So I'm going to be a cynic on that and say that I think it really does have to do with people being able to more easily, more facile development of empathy based on the sufferer being their same culture, if you will. I mean, it could be a religious person that affects you in the way that it hits you right between the heart, and whatever it is, I agree with Judge Martinez Jones. It's all good. It's all good. I'm going to touch a little bit on, because I think in the trenches we see a lot of what you all will be able to countenance as the reality of their experience, and that is the stigma. So the addicted person in coming into a courtroom, they're used to the child welfare system and the criminal justice system, and they're afraid that the child welfare system, and I think legitimately and righteously, will take their kids. The criminal justice system, they believe they will be prosecuted for injury to a child. And sadly, that is the truth. And that's where I think these plans of safe care are going to go a long way in really guiding the government, the state, the DA's offices, and the attorney ad litems for the child on how we can better treat kids and families in order to better both sides and in the best interest of the child. Ironically, the very best thing for society is that the newborn baby and the mom have their plan of safe care together with supports. I do want to say something about the sausage making that is done behind the scenes here. The justice system, we are very inclined toward being punitive. We are very inclined toward judgment. I always tell new judges, be as least amount of judgy as you possibly can.
And that's hard given the title, right?
Yeah, it is. It is. The medical system is teaching us that the mom and the child are sick. I think that is just incredibly moving, and I am here for it. And I support you going further and just letting your position be known to the courts. The justice system officials, we have to be really intentional about seeing them as sick, because we come from a long line of essentially being punitive in our outcomes, in our recommendations, in our rulings. And by recommendations, I'm saying the state is recommending all these services that may or may not meet this family's needs if they have substance use disorder and the baby has neonatal abstinence syndrome. And I think that's it. Oh, I know. The one thing that I want to keep reminding myself and everyone else, it's really counterintuitive, because your mind wants to judge these people. Like, why would you use drugs while you're pregnant? And it's really the best interest if we see the mom as sick and suffering, and as a patient getting well. So fight against our intuitions, which tend to be more prejudiced and biased. Back to you, Judge.
Yeah, and we have a good comment. They are not bad people trying to be good. They are sick people trying to get well. So I really like that. Yes.
Love that.
And so, as we now start to move into kind of the legal aspects where we are professionals in what we do, I wanted to make sure that we took the time to explain to you guys the way that we think about these families as a whole, because in a full disclaimer, all the judges in Texas are not like us. We're working on it, but all the judges in Texas are not like us. And these are important aspects of understanding how Judge Wheelis and myself come to the decisions that we make, and why we think that the way that we're doing it is the most culturally responsive, trauma informed, and innovative way in which we need to move forward to have progress in our field as well. So we did want to take time to share those things with you. And so then let's talk law, right? That's what y'all came to hear the judges talk about. And so we have the Texas Family Code, section 153.002. It's very, very simple. And I love it because it gives us so much discretion when we are talking about these issues in the room to be innovative the way we're talking and to take into consideration all these other aspects. But basically says the best interest of the child shall always be the primary consideration of the court in determining the issues of conservatorship and possession of and access to the child. And conservatorship is just Texas fancy way of saying custody. But we get to always, and it says shall, so that's a thing that we have to do, be considering best interest of the child in all of our decisions when we're talking about custody, possession, and access. And I know that we have some individuals who are familiar with the court system. I don't know if everybody gets to peek behind the curtain when we talk about child welfare cases and how they come through the system to the court. I'll briefly talk to you about how cases get started in my court. Judge Wheelis might have a slightly different process, but in my court, you know, I'm the judge who's responsible for all the cases in Travis County. It's our population of 1.2 million here in the capital. And I have an associate judge who helps me. Between the two of us, we handle all of our cases. We've got about 1,500 kids who are involved in the child welfare system. Right now, I'm bringing the numbers down, but we've got almost 900 cases. That's a lot for two judges that are very involved. But every single day, I get an email from my prosecutors who say, this is how many cases we have to file today, Judge. And then between myself and the other judge, whoever's available will say, send them to me by email. And so then the state will send us the CPS investigators affidavit. It states all the process that they went into to make reasonable efforts to prevent a removal. It'll tell us about the allegation. It'll tell us about their whole investigation, and it'll give their request, whether they're requesting to remove the child and why. In my jurisdiction, they can request for the court to go into drug court, or they can request for the family to come to court. I'll just issue an order for them to appear to decide whether or not we're going to take temporary custody. And so I have some choices. My prosecutor sends me two different orders. One is if I'm going to remove the kid, and one if I'm not, I'm going to let the kiddo stay with mom, and we're going to either do drug court or just come to court and check in. And I read that affidavit. If I have questions, I email back to the prosecutor. The prosecutor goes back to the investigator. We sort it out. I do some things like keeping them accountable for family decision making, so they can do a family team meeting to see if there's other family members or if there's other possibilities to prevent a removal. But that's all that's happening. It's an email to the court. I don't have anybody else presenting their side of the story. And so I set a hearing within 14 days, and that's when they come to court for the first time to give me their side of the story. And then I will make a decision on how we move forward. That's how the cases get started. Every single time there is an allegation of abuse or neglect, it goes to state office, one location, and that's whenever they decide what county it needs to go in and whether it's going to be investigated and what kind of priority it needs. And then they decide if it's coming to court or not. There's opportunity for the state to work with families just through family-based safety services without needing court intervention. But those are decisions that the state makes, and the state alone decides how they're moving that forward. So the court accountability doesn't start until the court is requested to be involved. But that's how it occurs in my court. Judge Wheelis, do you have a little different process on how you get those ex parte hearings done?
We do. I'm very impressed that you, in a very large county, handle all of the child welfare cases. We share child welfare cases among 5 courts. So the district clerk randomly assigns a removal from the state. It's the DA's office as well, the prosecutor, and they randomly get assigned to one of our 5 courts. And then they come to us for the same reading of the affidavit. And as you say, it is only one side. Some of you on this call may have actually served as prosecutors. I did not. I don't know about Judge Martinez-Jones.
I have not.
Neither. So we are familiar with responding to an allegation more than we are familiar with the prosecution of the case, where every word should be so carefully curated that you have literally the highest civil damage that can be done to anyone is the removal of my children. I mean, it was often the case that when my kids were young, I would be like, well, at least I can't take my kids from me. Well, in this case, they are precisely doing just that. And so I think it should be noted that our investigators, our workers, our FBSS workers, that's family-based safety services, as Judge Martinez Jones pointed out, are rock stars, but they're human as well. And they're accepting calls from people who may or may not have credibility issues in the public. So you have mandatory reporters, but then you also have people who are trying to use vengeful tactics in terms of making CPS reports. So they have a lot to sort through. So it's really important for the judge to take a moment. Like if I'm in the middle of trial, I will either say, please take it to another CPS judge, or I will take a break, step down even from a jury trial, because you really need to pay close attention. Oftentimes you'll see layers of stigma and all of that in the report itself. And that is not usually coming directly from the investigator. That is usually coming from medical providers, social workers, teachers, all manner of anonymous and non-anonymous reporters. So suffice it to say that if you had an opinion that this person was doing the best they could to remain, sober in your treatment program, that would go a very long way to advising the court in a fair manner that, judge, you don't have to remove this child. You can actually support the medical provider who is currently providing services to this very cooperative mom. And I think we're moving more and more toward that with, as you said, family first legislation, that we're all going to see more and more support of family-based safety services, which means you leave the family intact. I was going to tell you later, but back in the day when I first started in this job, I had all the CPS cases in my court, and the state was literally recommending that we have grandma move her daughter out of her home so that she could be the placement for the baby or kid. And now we're realizing that the mom needs to be there taken care of as a sick patient getting well as the baby who is a sick patient getting well. So back to you, Judge Martinez.
Yes. And I think those were all good points, and especially the changes that we're seeing and the shift of how it's presented to us. But as we talked about before, we do also keep an eye out for those systemic inequities when we're reading through these, right? And like I said, Judge Wheelis and I are making very mindful efforts to intentionally do that work. Not all judges do, but those kinds of biases come out. I can look at an affidavit that doesn't have race and ethnicity information, but the way they describe any drug use, the way that they describe where the family is living, I can come to a conclusion of what race or ethnicity I think the family is. And so just because we're not explicitly saying it doesn't mean that it is not still something that's playing in, as a factor implicitly into our minds. And then how do we treat those families? Am I going to treat the family the same if they come from the good part of town and they have an addiction to opiates, but they have family members who want to support them, but they have a baby who has been born with NAS? Or am I going to treat the family who comes from the east side of my town, which is where the communities of color are, and who have a baby who is suffering from withdrawal from use of crack cocaine? Am I going to treat them differently? And their home conditions maybe aren't the same, but they also have family who all have criminal backgrounds. So we see these things play out with systemic barriers coming through. And then we're here to make a best interest of the child decision about how we're going to treat those cases. And it's very important that we're mindful every step of the way of all the barriers that come into place with how they may or may not be getting support. In my jurisdiction, law enforcement is the top reporter to CPS, followed by schools, followed by hospitals and medical care professionals. I think in most jurisdictions, it's just swapped at the top with schools first and then law enforcement. But these other systems that we know have inequities are the primary ones that are calling child welfare whenever they have concerns. And so we know, and the data shows, we have disproportionate outcomes of what families are coming to the attention of the court. And so we're taking that into consideration when we have this law here that says best interest of the child is the primary concern. So what is a judge to do? Do we have any guidance? We do. We have a little bit of guidance. We have case law in Texas. We call them our Hawley factors because there's a specific case that it's named after, where our Texas Supreme Court does give us some guidance about the things that we consider whenever we're talking about best interest and how we make best interest decisions. So we have here a short list. This is not inclusive of the only things. And, again, there's judicial discretion in how we think about this, and we'll talk about, but so that I can read it out, some of those things that we consider are desires of the child, emotional and physical needs of the child now and in the future, emotional and physical danger to the child now and in the future, parental abilities of the individual seeking custody, programs available to assist these individuals to promote the best interest of the child, plans for the child by these individuals or the agency seeking custody, stability of the home or proposed placement, acts or omissions of the parent, which may indicate that the existing parent-child relationship is not a proper one. Sorry for the typo. And then any excuse for the acts or omissions of the parent. So it's really telling us to do our diligence in thinking through the circumstances of each individual family. When we talk about infants and we are looking at that first one, desires of the child, that's an interesting one because we have something called substituted judgment because every child gets an attorney in our Texas child welfare cases. And if that child isn't verbal enough to be able to direct their attorney about what they want, then they do have an opportunity, the lawyer, to substitute their judgment on what they think the child wants. And I do that as a judge too. I think if I'm this infant, I'm just born, and all I know is my mommy, what would I want in this moment? And I take that into consideration in how I decide, especially when we have parents who are suffering from substance use disorder, about how I can keep a family together, how I can keep them together safely, and how they can be supported. One of the new notions that we're thinking about when we talk about mandated reporting and how we have an obligation, not only as just an individual, but as a professional, to let child welfare know if you have a concern for abuse or neglect. What if we were also responsible for mandated supporting? So not only am I just making a report, but I'm mandated to support this family, provide referrals, get them connected, assure they have their plans of safe care, or whatever it may be. And those are some of the things that we take into consideration, because if a family needs additional support and they have a plan to get that additional support, then would that not be in the child's best interest? And so Judge Wheelis, you want to add some thoughts on best interest?
I think you're brilliant, Judge Martinez-Jones, because you're absolutely right that by collaborating with the medical professional, you would have everything on the Hawley factors that we need being presented to you right at the get-go. Getting back to one of your points that you raised, I have the benefit of having one of my best friends who is also a colleague, and she is willing to literally read a 40-page, affidavit of removal for me, because oftentimes you think, is it just me, or is, somebody catastrophizing normal behavior? And in sometimes when we arrive at this conclusion that normal behavior, normal response to someone removing my children would be very hostile and aggressive, let me just tell you.
Right.
And so that would be toward medical personnel, that would be toward a teacher, that would be toward anyone, but it seems to only get described as aggressive. And I use that word very specifically when referring to African-American males, particularly. It seems to me that we do have to be extraordinarily mindful of how we are writing words that might literally affect a child for the rest of their lives. What we know about trauma is that any removal, no matter how quickly you return, is traumatizing to the point where it increases all sorts of negative outcomes in the life of the child down the road. I do want to say that, like, best interest from behind the Oz curtain, reality versus theory, basically. When I started this job 16 years ago, we were all rather harsh and judgmental about moms using during pregnancy. Regrettably, I now see the error of my ways, but I actually want to say to you that we could use the help of the medical providers in turning all of our minds to a more open-minded, that, the knowledge that you have could assist us at every level with outcomes in these child welfare cases. I think a lot of the child welfare system is still stuck in that frame of mind. I realize that stopping use abruptly, logically, I've always known that stopping any use, say you're taking an antidepressant or you're an SSRI or something, and you can't stop it abruptly, you have to titrate with medical intervention and all that. Well, we all know that logically, but then when we apply it to the people before us in court, we're being so judgmental about something that might kill their baby or themselves. So we have to be more careful. And as Judge Martinez Jones stated, we have to be intentional. These mothers and fathers in my county are being charged with endangerment, which is a felony offense. They are being charged with endangerment. These plans of safe care could go a long way in ameliorating the effects of even criminal justice charges. I truly believe in my innermost self that every person who is doing drugs or using only intends to harm themselves. I truly believe that. And so I just want everyone to be mindful that they are being judged as if they are essentially trying to harm their child, even in the criminal justice system. So it's pretty hard to get sober when you're facing criminal charges in one court and you're maybe participating and doing everything you're asked to do in another court in your CPS case. So, and it's just, we have to get this sort of counterintuitive response dealt with and handled, that more visitation is better for the child than less visitation. I have often got prosecutors and attorney ad litems recommending to me that, no, the parent needs more sobriety. So it's like, how much is good enough for that child who's missing their mom? So who is being punished? Who are we punishing? The child. So back to you, Judge.
And so as we look at, why is it so important that we're talking about, how we come to the decision to even start a case? Why is that best interest decision so important? Why are these Holly factors so important? Well, when we do get parents into our courts for these child welfare cases, I think most of you all know, but we do have a period of time because we're dealing with constitutional rights. And so we look at this as the 14th Amendment, right? Life, liberty, freedom to parent. But I also look at it as a balance of the parent's constitutional rights and the child's constitutional rights. And the child didn't always have rights. There was a time when children were property, right? And so we have children's rights now. They have the right to be free from harm, right? And that goes to their 14th Amendment of their life and liberty and freedom from harm. And so when we're balancing the two, we have the opportunity in this case, when we have the state intervened and this constitutional gravity that's at play, which likens us a little bit, even though we're under the family code and we're civil, it's very similar to criminal because we're removing that liberty, that freedom as well. And so it's a very interesting piece of civil law and civil litigation that we're in when the state is involved, but we give an opportunity for the parents to alleviate the concerns that brought them to our courts in the first place. And as we're moving through the case, we're providing the service plan, which comes from the department. We're regularly reviewing what's going on and trying to determine whether or not we're ready to return a child if we weren't able to actually keep a family together in the first place. But we go through this process and we have a deadline that our legislators have given us, which is a year. We have a possibility for a one-time extension of 6 months. Once we return children, we have an opportunity to extend that time a little bit more for 6 months. Sometimes that return doesn't work out. And if it fails and we have to remove again, we can extend it another 6 months. And right now, during the pandemic, we have some emergency orders that allow us to kind of suspend all these deadlines until a time further out, which is in hopes, hopefully, to get us through a backlog of cases that were kind of in a holding pattern or a standstill for various different reasons, some including access to providers during the pandemic. So right now we're in a weird time. Generally speaking, we want to only spend about a year doing this. Sometimes it can go up to a year and a half or 2 years, depending on what's going on. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do in my program about those timelines, because we all know recovery is a lifelong journey and it's one day at a time. And it's a lot that we're expecting from parents suffering from substance use disorder to get well so fast and be able to prove it to a court. But the reason that we go through all these painstaking efforts to assure constitutionality is because we have some very serious outcomes. And we'll talk about these outcomes and then talk about our programs here in a minute. But parents' rights to their children can get terminated. That's kind of the ultimate outcome that we're trying to avoid as we help provide a path to keeping their rights to their child, a path to keeping the family preserved or reunifying the family. And just to put it out there, I know the legal system is not adept in medical terminology or even in sound medical logic, I guess, because we have this born addicted piece of our law that I know does not make sense in the medical field, but this is what the law says. And it says that, one, we have this different definition of what being born addicted means. And it, in our Texas law, it means a child who is born to a mother who during the pregnancy used a controlled substance, and they have the definition under the Health and Safety Code, other than a controlled substance that was legally obtained by prescription or alcohol. And so it means it has to meet both of these points, that after birth, as a result of that use, the child experiences observable withdrawal from the alcohol or controlled substance, exhibits observable or harmful effects in the child's physical appearance or functioning, or exhibits the demonstrable presence of alcohol or controlled substance in the child's bodily fluid. So the meconium, the withdrawal symptoms, it has to have all of that, and that the mother used during pregnancy, not a prescription. If that's the case, then we have this other part that says the court may order the termination of the parent-child relationship if we find by clear and convincing evidence, and I pulled this out, that the parent has, this is R, which means there's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, and some other reasons why we can terminate parents' rights. There's a lot of reasons that rights can be terminated, but R is the one that's most relevant, that the parent has been the cause of the child being born addicted to alcohol or a controlled substance other than a controlled substance legally obtained by prescription, and which means it has to have this second finding that the termination is in the best interest of the child. So we got that best interest in there, but you can see that most parents in this situation come in already with those grounds found, right? Like, it's very factual. If we have meconium from a baby, that shows that there were substances detected in that child's system. We have people at the hospital who can tell us about withdrawal symptoms. Most often we have parents who have done a urine analysis during pregnancy that had a substance that was identified. And so that best interest sometimes is the big deal about whether or not a parent's rights is going to be terminated on this ground. And there's another ground that talks about it after providing the parent the substance use disorder treatment, that they had another relapse and were not able to maintain their sobriety and recovery. I didn't put that one here. I just put this one very specifically, but there are a couple of other grounds related to substance use that do fall into a reason why their rights can be terminated. I will say in my jurisdiction, oftentimes my prosecutors don't go for this one, but they do go for a failure to complete their court-ordered services, which is an O ground. And that's basically if they went through treatment and then they were ordered to go through another stint of inpatient, and at some point they decide not to, and they didn't get all the parenting and things like that. I think that's just a little more palatable for our prosecutors to go with that ground rather than this one. But this is what it looks like. And the involuntary termination of a parent's rights means that they have no more legal rights to that child. They don't have a right to see the child. They don't have a right to get information on that child. They don't have a right to be involved ever again. They cannot modify an order that terminates their rights to try and get their rights back right now. That's not in the law of what they can do. And so this is a very severe situation. And when a child's both of their parents' rights are terminated, that's when we have a child that's legally available for adoption. And so oftentimes with infants, that's the path that the Child Welfare Agency really wants to go down, because they know that there is a lot of families out there who are willing to adopt babies, and they don't want babies stuck in a system because we don't have any family members or other people who want to share custody with the parent who suffers from substance use disorder. So that's the reality of what's happening in the legal case. Judge Wheelis, you want to add to that?
I do agree that it is the unfortunate writing, because born addicted is an interesting, I guess, assumption. The other thing is there are so many layers to the infant, what substance is used, how the mom's body processes the substances, licit or illicit. And it's interesting because this includes obtained by prescription. Well, as we all know, in the trenches, legally prescribing an opioid is not necessarily outcome determinative for that child and that mom. So it's a struggle, to fit these in. And it's exactly as Judge Martinez Jones was pointing out, that this is what we deal with all the time, every week, in and out, all year long. Moms and dads who both suffer from substance use disorder. Sometimes the family is being, righteously, I'm sure, cutting them out of their lives. That's probably the person we should most likely place with, is the grandparent who's no longer speaking to her daughter. And but what I'm all about is trying to find a way where the mom and the child can live with the grandparent, live in the placement, and all be cocooned together. I noticed one of the professionals in the chat was saying that she'd like to see more, he or she would like to see more education for the grandparents. That is essential. And, our bandwidth in CPS cases is not that broad. There are child-specific contracts that you can make favoring a grandparent receiving some services independently, but unless they're the placement, and we haven't tried to do like a monitored return to the parent at the grandparent's home, it's hard to bootstrap that additional service onto the placement. But I'm all for
Add
it.
to that real quick. As a court, the placement, the grandparent, I usually, unless they've intervened in the lawsuit, do not have them in my jurisdiction to make them do anything. So what I could do is order that CPS provides something to them. But if they say they're not interested, or they haven't done any kind of, Al-Anon or something like that, to understand the importance of them also being actively engaged in the recovery of their loved one, it gets really difficult. And so I agree with that education piece, not only on the skin to skin and those kinds of things, but in general about what we're trying to do and the journey that their loved one is going on through recovery.
Amen. And voluntary is always, we are always encouraging. I feel I can speak for Judge Martinez Jones. We always encourage voluntary, Families Anonymous, Al-Anon, all the things that would educate and support. And, frankly, I don't know about you all, but when my children were going through stuff and I was told I needed to go to family counseling, which I was completely offended because I know a lot about a lot, but I participated. You're welcome. And I found that I could learn new tricks about de-escalation. And, what we find by looking just slightly under the surface is that there is a lot of all or nothing thinking in these families. There's a lot of rigidity. There's a lot of pointing to the identified patient, which some of you are familiar with that theory, where everybody points to the child who's misbehaving, and we don't have to look at ourselves and how we're instigating that type of behavior, or how our own life doesn't reflect what we'd like it to be, as peaceful and everybody in a healthy, functional, emotional sense. And so really, it stands to reason that these people don't just develop in the wild. They are, not falling far from the trees. And my family is no exception. None of us are any exception. We're all actually related. by DNA. I just had a criminal trial last week, and I am now an expert. Ask me anything about autosomal septillion. One of the cases we had on Monday, I do want to note, and again, getting back to that idea that NAS is created by a lot of biological things and scientific things that are over my head, but it seems to me that I rarely see that with other than opioids. So having said that, in a case on Monday, we had a, let's see, I'm going to talk about two cases on Monday, but one was a mom who had declined drug court and dropped out of inpatient. And then because she got into a fight with another patient at the inpatient facility. And I'm like, girl, you have got to ignore that drama. That's a gnat or a fly. You have to focus. And, but I was inclined to judge, and I caught myself in time because she had left this treatment because, you know, the government, we're here to help you. We move so slowly that it's almost like you're out of the woods. Now you're feeling fine and you could, you know, knock down a house and rebuild it. You have to provide treatment when the person is ready and they're at their bottom. And so in this case, the CVS worker was like a unicorn and provided the inpatient treatment right when the mom was, you know, at the bottom of her fight. So I really commended the worker and was irritated because our young mom was, you know, failed out essentially and left. But then I caught myself and I, you know, employed my own drug court thinking and training. And I encouraged her that she needed to get an IOP and promised her that it was in her child's best interest to have the more visitation, the more sober she was. So I was very lucky. I also think it's disrespectful for us not to be honest as judges who are, in fact, at the time of the hearing, sober, to observe that this mom, I said to her, you think right now that you are sober, right? Because it's been at least 12, maybe even 24 hours since your last use. And she was being very honest. I was, you know, praising her for her honesty, in fact. But you are displaying behaviors. You're walking around while on the Zoom hearing. You're, you know, you're very jumpy and antsy, and I can tell you think you're sober, but I'm just here to tell you that that is not what a sober person looks like. So you don't even know when you are, you know, in fact straight or not, or clean or not, even if your last use was 24 hours plus ago. And I tell you that because I think it's disrespectful for me not to be honest with you and to sort of observe these things, but not be helpful about it. So.
Thank you. And I agree. And I try and start off, and we're going to next talk about our individual courts and kind of how we do things. But I share that philosophy of, you know, I know that I'm asking you to trust me, which is an odd thing because you just met me. So I'll work to build up my trust with you, and I'm going to ask you to do the same with me. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt until you give me a reason. Otherwise, I'm going to trust what you tell me. And I'm going to be honest with you, and I'm going to tell you what you can expect. So you can always ask me and I will be honest with you. And it's really important as judges when we start off those relationships, what it really turns out to be, especially in our drug court programs, with the parents in the programs, to assure that we are giving the best possible opportunity for successful outcome in our work with them. I do have one comment and question also that was here in the chat before we move on. It says, I believe it is encouraging to have two judges that share the mindset of caregivers. Bias are important to see, acknowledge, and rule out. Too often does addict equate to criminal. How does this perspective begin to spread to the smaller courts in which the majority of us work? And I had said before, we're working on it. Judge Wheelis and I have done some presentations together. We have presented to a lot of judges in Texas who do child welfare work. We've presented through the Children's Commission, which is a Texas Supreme Court initiative to help with education of all of our child welfare judges in Texas. And so we do what we can. And I think that this is a trend that's only picking up for Texas judges as far as being more mindful in how we move forward and think about the work that we do on the bench and how we're responsive. So Judge Wheelis, I think you have a fire alarm situation or something going on.
Apparently, yes, at the courthouse. So, but I do want to say that I loved that comment, and I appreciate, we are trying, and in fact, Judge Martinez Jones and I present together on equity and trauma, because we need to think of everyone by asking the second question first. Like, what are you going through that's making you behave like that? You know, the second question is that guy on the subway whose kids are crawling all over, and you're like judging them for not maintaining discipline over their kids. And someone is nice and kind and says, hey, can I hold your baby for you while you, whatever he was doing. And he said, thank you so much for thinking of me and being kind, because their mother just died last week and they're just, you know, feeling out of sorts, of course.
Yeah.
So we need to ask the second question first. Everybody's going through something.
All right. And so then we'll talk a little bit about our respective courts, and then we'll have some time for some questions as well. So I'll tell you a little bit about my program in Travis County. I am so proud of my Travis County program. We've been going since 2008. It was started by the judge who presided in my bench before me, Judge Darlene Byrne, who's actually now our third court's Chief Justice of Third Court of Appeals. And so she came together with our community and said, what are we going to do to address all of these cases I'm seeing in my court involving parents with substance use disorder? I don't think we called it substance use disorder at that time, but that's what we did. We came together as a community in partnership with one of our local recovery centers, Austin Recovery, who has a family house where mothers and children are able to go. We've had a lot of journeys in this drug court program. And like I mentioned, since about 2008, I was a parent's attorney. So I was there from the beginning as a parent's attorney. And then in 2015, I became the presiding judge. And then this year as a district court judge, I'm bringing on my associate court judge so that my associate court judge can help preside over that family drug treatment court. But through our journey, we came through a lot of different experiences about how we manage these cases. I think y'all were able to hear from Marco Casada before, and he came from my program in Travis County. He was one of the supervisors who helped through the department in making sure that we were properly identifying parents to bring into the program, that we were making sure we were supportive, that we had a collaborative nature. We were continually educating ourselves and each other about, you know, the newest issues in drug testing or the newest trends that we see affecting our families and our parents. But when we started off our cases, we did have cases with removals. So these were in the temporary custody of the state. And what we were finding is how hard it is to expect a parent to change their life completely in the amount of time that we had. And so we started off with the idea that we want to get children with their parents as soon as possible. So we had our treatment providers, and we initially had a removal, got the parent started in their recovery, and then we were having the child join the parent towards the end of their treatment and then going out into the community. But we were finding that that was really difficult to juggle, and that if that didn't work because for whatever reason, then we had to fail a return and monitor, which means only that 6 months that I told you left in the case, that even when we placed with the child, it was going to be only 6 more months. So there was a lot of difficulties in trying to struggle through. Then we thought, you know, if we waited a lot longer, that gives us more time in the case, more time for the parent to get stable in the recovery, but that's more time away from their child. We could do really robust visitation, but it still wasn't the same. And our program was called Parenting in Recovery. So we had to get to a point where we said, what does that really mean to parent in recovery? Our treatment facility had the opportunity for parents to go into treatment for 90 days and bring their child. And so we said, what we're going to do is we're not going to remove. Even though we had all those grounds for termination at the affidavit when I was being presented with it, or the judges at the time, they were not granting any removals. And we got the agreement of our prosecutors, we got the agreement of the department, we worked together, and we collectively took what felt like a big risk and allowed babies to stay with their mothers without removing them and sent them to treatment together. So they could do all of the skin to skin. So they could do all of the robust parenting, the day to day, every nitty gritty piece of it. But I have to admit, it has to have been a lot harder than I can imagine when I had my baby the first 3 months, because I was not going through detox, and I was not trying to get stable in recovery. I was not going to programming. I wasn't doing any of those things. I wasn't suffering any of the effects of trying to get into recovery and completely changing all the people, places, and things in my life. But that's what our parents do. They're amazing. And so we start off with court ordered services cases, and this stays in the family based safety services unit of the department. We do not do removal, so our deadline doesn't start. And what we do is we allow the parents and the baby to go into treatment. They get 90 days of treatment. Then they were coming out in the community, and we realized that is great, but we were seeing a lot of struggles. A lot of struggles when you don't have the robust support of an entire treatment facility, you don't have on site daycare, and you still have all of these requirements. We have phases, we have 4 phases that they have to move through, and they advance, and then they graduate the program and they get their case closed. But it was really hard right at that intersection of getting out of inpatient treatment and going into the community. So what we realized is that they needed some more support, but out of inpatient. So we were able to get funding to provide sober living for parents for 3 months after they leave inpatient. So our program now looks like 90 days of inpatient, and then they transition to 90 days of sober living in a family house. We do use Oxford houses. I know y'all have heard from them. We have a couple of partnerships with house managers in our community. We consider them partners of our drug court, and we allow the families to stay together. And it's mostly our participants who are living in those family houses. There are some other community family members, families who are in recovery who are also in those sober housings. But then we've put together the 6 months of vast support for this parent to get really comfortable to parent in recovery. And we are providing the outpatient, and we're providing dental work, and we're providing all kinds of supports. As we continued moving through our program, we realized a lot of times as they were getting that support in their recovery, there were other things that still needed to be addressed. Most of our parents have dual diagnosis, so we're addressing those issues. A lot of them come from situations of family violence involving a partner or the father of the child or the mothers. And we brought on board our advocacy center for survivors of domestic violence. Safe Alliance is ours here, and they're a partner in our drug court. We also allow dads to be in the program. We don't have facilities where dads and children can go, but we make sure that their supports are very robust, and we facilitate visitation and support the family if they're going to be rejoining. But we also have those batterer intervention and prevention programs for when it's appropriate as well in those cases. So we're really investing in our families. And then the most recent thing that we added, because we realized there's so much that goes into completely changing your life, is EMDR therapy. So it's a very appropriate and responsive therapy for in-depth trauma, because we know a lot of our parents who suffer from substance use disorder have experienced a lot of traumatic things, and sometimes those can inhibit them from progressing or trigger a relapse. And so we've really done our best to try and pair as many services as we can through the program while we're here, to be able to provide the support and partner with different housing entities to try and make sure that they have independent housing. We have financial coaching that they go through as part of their program. We also have peer recovery coaches that they engage with while they're going through their program, and they're expected to do their recovery related meetings, NA or AA, have a sponsor, do all of that. We have a child and family therapist that engages with each family and their child, even if it's an infant. This child and family therapist helps parents to really be able to create those bonds that are so important, and to, without, in a developmentally appropriate way for an infant to have a parent, to have a therapeutic relationship with them. So we've done some amazing things. Sustaining it has been insane, but it's always an adventure, and looking at the next grant, the next funding source. We're on this journey of equity as well, because again, if we want to go back to the differences, we have a disproportionate number of families of color in the child welfare system. But you just heard all the investment we put into parents. That is not even including the gift cards and all the strollers and all the things that we provide. But we have more white families in my drug court program than families of color. And in the child welfare system, where you see more families of color, you wouldn't expect that to be in this program that invests so much, but that's part of the bias that we're talking about. That when we have this opportunity to invest all the supports and all the funding and all the money and all the housing and all the treatment, we're still not doing it in a proportionate way for the families that need the support. And so we've gone on this equity journey with what are the systemic barriers and the biases that are playing into the way that families come into our program. What are the cultural stigmas about asking for help or accepting help or engaging in the recovery community where you have to have brutal honesty and air out everything that you've done? Are there cultural barriers to the expectations for success in our program? And is that why we're seeing the kind of engagement and lack thereof for families of color? We had a recent study that showed us that African-American women were having the least amount of success in our program. And so we've dug down to try and figure out why. And so we're working through those things. We have an equity work group for drug courts specifically to make sure that we're drilling down on that. And once we got very mindful of it, and the department is kind of our gatekeeper, they have a very specific drug unit that really advises the rest of the investigations on which cases are appropriate for drug court. We talked to them about what we were seeing. We showed them the data. And what we did was we removed bias and barriers across the board. Not saying we want to look specifically for families of color, we want to look specifically for moms of color. We just said across the board, we're not going to expect these things. We're not going to mandate that they have to say X, Y, and Z magic words. We're going to offer to everybody who has a substance use disorder and a child. Like, let's just offer across the board. When we did that, we saw, and this was like maybe a 3-month snapshot, we had 22 new participants. And in that time frame, when we just dropped all the barriers and we consulted all the parents who would be eligible, we ended up with 17 out of the 22 being parents of color. So immediately switching from all of these very specific things, well, they have to admit that they need help and be willing to join the program today. Well, is that really necessary? Because sometimes that's not where they're at tomorrow. And so it really made a difference, and we're starting to see better outcomes with equity, but we're continuing to make sure that we drill down into any of those other barriers that may be apparent. And that was just without even trying to specifically target more families of color, just dropping barriers altogether. We saw that improve altogether. And so I'm happy to answer more questions about my program because I'm very, very excited about it. And I love our program. We do great work and we collaborate very diligently. We've had over 175 graduates from our program. We've served over 460 children. And so we do a lot of good work in our community. But I want to give Judge Wheelis an opportunity to talk about your program.
Well, my BFF is actually the primary purveyor in our county of family preservation drug courts. So Judge Tucker in our county, I have 4 specialty courts. I have a juvenile drug court. I have GEMS Girls Court, which is our response to child sex trafficking in our county, which is prevalent. We have a diversionary court called See It, Treat It, and Divert It for also child sex trafficking, but basically runaways and those folks that are called status offenders for juvenile delinquency purposes. And then we have a mental health and intellectual and developmental disability court, specialty court. So we have a large rural population in Collin County, but it's an affluent county. So it's kind of a disparate effect in terms of the people and the types of drugs that we see most prevalent. So we have a huge meth problem. We're part of the corridor, the 35 corridor up to Sherman, that a lot of meth gets transported across those lines. And in our county, we have this affluent population that ends up getting addicted to prescription painkillers. So we have both sides of the spectrum in terms of drug use. And in Collin County, our drug court, in accordance with the drug court guidelines, requires voluntary participation. So much to what Judge Martinez Jones was speaking about, I'm going to immediately pass along your equity intervention at the at the outset, because even an AA program only requires an honest desire, right? So you don't have to come in admitting that, I cannot actually, do anything without my addiction. I personally cannot do anything without my addiction to coffee. So what we do is we will refer the family to the drug court, and the drug court team in Judge Tucker's court reviews the applicant, and basically they accept all comers, and but the family may decline. So, a lot of juveniles are like herding cats. I would suggest the same thing is true in our child welfare system. It is like herding cats. So, and you can go back and forth. So basically they decline to be in the family preservation drug court, so they come back to my court. I still try to utilize my drug court training to have that sort of team-like approach, because what we know about the people that are addicted to or have substance use disorder, because honestly, that addiction word, that will cause people to run from us and not accept our help. So I have got to stop using that, because first of all, I deal with juveniles primarily in terms of the criminal justice system, but in their lives, they're able to function. And so substance use disorder really does I think, satisfy them in a better way. Again, I want to get back to my view of the people that are using substances, is that they are telling us, like canaries did in the coal mines by their death, that there was carbon monoxide, that there was going to be a fire in the mine, that there was going to be a collapse in the mine, and that all manner of disaster was about to happen. They are telling us that our culture is sick. It is not political, what I'm telling you. It is a fact of our lives. There is a level of trauma out there, and it's being re-triggered by, in my opinion, social media. I think social media is one of the worst possible outcomes of the internet that there is. And the reason for that thinking is because, when I was young, I could go home and, basically get away from my bullies. My kids in court, our kids in the child welfare system, our kids in general, literally have their bullies in their pockets, and they never escape. And they're always there to watch that train wreck, even including them being the victim of the bullying. So, I often give this picture to my kids in court where a girl is talking on the phone and she is connected to the wall by cord, and like her mom is in the 5 feet away cooking dinner. That was my life. And we don't even begin to understand the pressures that these kids are under. Layer on top of that any abuse that's happened to them, layer on top of that any race-based trauma that's happened to them, and you've got pretty much a perfect storm for the need for relief from reality. And I say that in the most respectful manner. I just want all of us to understand that reality is a really tough place to be. And the fact that they have determined, or that their brain has determined, the best possible way to get out of this place is by using drugs, is not the brain working incorrectly. It's in fact a perfectly biological response. It's a very tough place. And all of these substances that we're talking about in and of themselves are addictive. So they're telling us about the levels of trauma in our community. So if the person fails out of drug court, so first is the layer of people who decline to participate in drug court in our county. So they come back to our court, and I still treat them as if they were in drug court for purposes that I can be responsive about. Then there are the people that fail out of drug court. I still believe in the policy of, you don't drive straight to termination from that point, because remember, it takes about 7 different inpatient treatments to gather any true contiguous sobriety. So I am unusually not cynical about treatment. I am very much in favor of continuing to, do the same thing over and over, expecting different results, and I get them routinely. So I think it is not unusual for a person to go through many different treatments. And so in this case the other day, where I was encouraging the mom to get right into IOP because she had left the inpatient treatment that was provided to her in a prompt fashion by the government, I told her that will never happen again, but we can get you into IOP pretty promptly. So I'm utilizing my drug court training to try to, assist this mom getting her child back. But I often tell the people, the parties in my court, that I was a great mom until I had kids. And so that usually disarms the situation. But again, I try to do no harm by my words, because words have hurt these people. Words have significantly hurt these people by people who look like me and are in positions of authority. So I'm very careful about trying to use my words carefully so that I don't escalate them and don't trigger them. So the ways that I know are hard for them from us, and I mean us in a completely inclusive sense, both judges and I, and all of you medical providers, we can be very harmful and trigger these people if we show disrespect, dismissiveness, or lack of honesty. They are smart. They are actually really smart. That study's been done for a different day. I had a heartbreaking case on Monday, and I do want to share about it. I had a mom who she appeared at the 14-day sort of accidentally. She was living with her drug dealer, and he wanted the child. I don't know. It was a strange, nefarious situation. He wanted the child. The mom and dad were his tenants in common. She declined drug court, though she initially showed signs of wanting it. And this is why Judge Martinez Jones is right on target. If you get a person right at the beginning of, hey, you're either going to go into drug court or you're going to lose your children, I'm very cooperative. If you're going to take my kids, I'm going to go ahead and participate in your lovely program. So she declined drug court, but it was a delay. It was a delay in when we offered it to her, and she was crying and losing her child at the hospital. So I'd like to close that gap as well. She dropped out of inpatient. Let's see, she declined drug court, dropped out of inpatient. She declined to ever visit her baby after the baby left the hospital and went to foster care. She declined treatment. She declined to name her baby, knowing even that we could not legally do it without her. This is her second neonatal abstinence syndrome constellation of symptoms baby. And I honestly, with all my heart, hated to terminate her parental rights, because what I know is that if this mom, when she was all sorts of willing to go to treatment, to think about drug court and all that at the hospital, if the medical provider had been just a slightly more aggressive, or maybe even just assertive, because I know all providers are just actually nurturing humans. They're not like us. We're type A aggressive folks, but we need you all. We defend your right to be very, very giving, loving, and nurturing. If we had a plan of safe care coming from the expert, which you all, every one of you are, I believe she would have been able to trust us, and perhaps we could have bridged that gap for at least her second child. So, and that baby, got a great foster mom who's actually a nurse herself. But again, I just think the best interest of every child is just to be with their parent where possible. Back to you, Judge.
And so I want to share a couple of extra thoughts, but wanted to go ahead and give you all our email addresses. We are kind coming to the end of our time. So if you do have a question that you want to ask, if you can put it in the chat and let us know. Or I think if you have the hand raising feature, you want to actually raise your hand and ask a question on video, we're happy to take that too. I wanted to mention something that you were talking about where you discussed, even if they're not in the program or they didn't get to finish the program or didn't complete that on your docket, you're also employing your skills from the drug court program. I'll say when our community had the conversation back in 2007, 2008 to start our family drug court program, one of the cells that we had was that it's going to not only impact the families who are able to engage in the program, but it's going to impact the whole community and all of the docket. And I will say that's absolutely true. So we have had a huge culture shift from it is so risky to put a baby with a person who suffers from substance use disorder. We can't take that risk to let's see how we can keep a baby with a parent who has substance use disorder. It was a hard shift for CPS. It was a hard shift for our prosecutors. It was a hard shift for our attorney ad litems. And it's something that does play out in our cases where we don't have drug court involved. We say, is there family, just like you're talking about, is there grandma, is there aunt, uncle, can mom move in with them? So it is huge shifts and impact to the entire docket. And when we brought in our advocates from SAFE, we saw the same as it relates to family violence, that the idea that children shouldn't be removed from a survivor of domestic violence is better than removing children from the home altogether. And we're even moving into the space that it's still very uncomfortable, but can a family be safe and together? When there has been family violence and dynamics of power and control, what kind of supports, what kind of safety plans, what can be done to help a family be safe and together? So we're still working on that path, but we've seen a lot of shifts. And I do take a lot of accountability from the bench being a part of the leadership in shifting cultures, especially around language and removing stigma. And some of that discussion has been in the language that we use, making sure we talk about our parents as suffering from substance use disorder or recovering from substance use disorder, being very intentional and mindful about that. When we talk about drug testing, we shifted our language. And for me, a lot of it I felt was for the benefit of my team. My team would often feel, I think, hurt personally whenever we would have drug testing that looked like there was no drug use going on, but then to find out that something was going on that they didn't know about. I think what you said as far as being very smart, people who are recovering from substance use disorder are very smart. They're also charismatic, funny. Some of the best people that I've known, when someone's in recovery and that light inside shines, it's a wonderful thing. But they're also, when they're in their addiction, they're crafty and they may be able to get past drug testing. And whenever it looks like somebody has been sober and then it turns out that they weren't, and you've been using words like they are clean, they're not using, their tests are all negative, then it has a certain implication when you find out that's not the case, that you were wrong. So I talked to my team and we had a very intentional discussion about changing our language. And I said, for the benefit of removing stigma and bias, not saying clean and dirty, positive, negative, that's confusing all around, let's just call it what it is. This parent had a test showing substances detected, or this parent had a test that shows no substances detected, because that gets to the heart of what it really is. It is a test that shows there are either substances or not substances, and has no indication on whether or not you believe that they are completely sober or not. And what that has done is really shifted from the legal aspect, the idea of what are we using the drug testing for? And I hope Marco talked to you about it. But our drug tests are tools. They're tools. What we're running in drug court is a program to help do a couple of things. Obviously, the big one is to keep parental rights intact, to help people maintain sobriety and actually be grounded in recovery. But we're also doing behavior modification and motivational interviewing, and some of the things that we've learned about from some federal best practices on key components of a family drug treatment court. There's certain things that you do. And one of those things is accountability and tools for that accountability. And accountability is for their sobriety and their recovery. A urine analysis test is a tool to help me keep a parent accountable on their journey. A hair test is a tool to help me keep a parent accountable. And so I have to take those tools as what they are, and not one is just the end all be all by itself. I have urinalysis tests, I have hair tests, I have nail tests, and I also have that parent's behaviors, their interactions with their child, and the way that they're engaging with all the professionals, their productivity in the community and jobs and maintaining stable housing. We have to look at the big picture, all of it together for me to get to that point where I'm going to say best interest or not, are we moving along the right path? And so when we changed our language, that helped us make what it is sound like what it is, in a tool to show us whether or not substances were detected. It's a bigger mouthful. People like saying it was clean or it was dirty or it was positive or it was negative, but it doesn't give us the accurate picture of what we're doing. And so I wanted to share, that. And I also wanted to share something really interesting that my program is doing, just because I think it's interesting as it relates to accountability. We have a provider in Austin that has drug testing, urinalysis drug testing, that I enjoy because I think it is more trauma responsive. So as I mentioned before, we have a lot of parents who have experienced trauma if they have suffered from substance use disorder. And sometimes that trauma does go into other sexual abuse based traumas. And so this facility is called Genotox, and it does not require observation for the urine analysis because it confirms the urine analysis by DNA. And so our parents go in and get a mouth swab when they sign up for the program, and then they can UA at their own home and put it in they get provided a kit, they put it in the kit and they just drop it off. And then the facility will run the test and then just use the biomarkers on the DNA. It's very specific biomarkers. It's not an expanded, it's not like the 23andMe stuff. It's just very specific to identifying the urine analysis, because we had a whole presentation being legally. I was like, I want to make sure if we're using DNA to confirm UAs that we're doing it soundly. So it's very really interesting process. And it tests for so many more things. And it can determine if they're medication compliant. So we have some parents who are on medication assisted treatment, and they are supposed to stay compliant with their MAT. And we can tell that. We can even tell if they're smoking cigarettes. And we've had very interesting hearings based on this because, when you factor in the genetics to help hold accountable for recovery and sobriety, it brings about different issues that we didn't even know was going on. And I think it's helping our program to be a little stronger. And just as an anecdote, I had one where methamphetamines and opiates were detected in one of the tests. But they said that they also had concerns that there was an attempt to falsify because they also detected the synthetic urine. So I had a whole evidentiary hearing with the forensic toxicologist, and it was a lot over my head going into the science of it. But it turned out, and the parent later admitted that she did attempt to use synthetic urine to pass this genetic biomarker test to confirm, and she spit into the synthetic urine because she thought that that would pick up her DNA. So then they would confirm that it was her sample. But whenever we went, I was like, if you would just apply that level of ingenuity to your program, I think we would be in a much better place. But as we went through it, and they were, before she admitted what she had done, they said, we detect synthetic urine, which absolutely should not be there. But we also detected methamphetamines and opiate use, and they went into how soon it should have been, because they said, we're not sure that we caught the DNA, because this is very unusual that we'd have synthetic urine and DNA, but they must have spit into it, or their finger must have had the drugs on it and got dipped into the synthetic urine, because their DNA is in there, but it's in there at such levels that we think that it was not through the process in which urine comes out. And then, so the parent admitted, she's like, I did, and then I spit in it, and I thought that would make it pass. And so it was just kind of an amazing thing about how close they got. But I wanted to share that there are new technologies and other tools coming out to help us do this work smarter. And like I said before, aside from how cool it is to be able to get that level of information, I really like that our parents can do their urine analysis in the comfort of their home. without being observed, without any traumatization from anything they may have experienced, and they can drop it off. They could do it in a timely way in which they're not missing work or things like that. It was a very big, helpful tool so that parents can stay compliant with their services, get their jobs, do all the things that they need to do, and we can still have a reliable resource to help us hold them accountable. And so I think that we should stay on top of innovation and thinking about other tools that could help us in working with families so that we can keep them safe, they can keep them preserved or reunified as soon as possible. But Judge Willis, anything else as we round out?
Brilliant example of their genius. You know, I couldn't have thought of that, spitting in it. What a great idea. You got to give them an A for trying.
I was like, wow.
Impressive. I wanted to bring up a point that you made along the way, and I'm envious of your program and your industry and all of your intentionality with regard to helping families stay preserved. Good for you, Judge. That smoking as an agonist to opioid, even in the medically assisted treatment. I know I'm saying a lot of words that are kind of losing some communication value, but in breastfeeding. So it's contraindicated to breastfeeding to smoke, but it is also because in this sense, they are antagonizing or agonizing the effects of the medically assisted treatment and passing it along to the baby. Well, in this case, again, contradictions and ironies throughout this whole world of substance use disorder and neonatal abstinence syndrome. The smoking is a great response for most people in recovery to replace or at least titrate off of the illicit non-medicine or non-prescription medicine to the either complete abstinence or the methadone. But to have to take away smoking is going to also be really hard on these mommies. The other thing is, I do like the idea that these programs that are available through HHSC and specifically Bexar County's program was so important because these babies are really difficult to soothe. And so it seemed to be to me that by watching the moms in the program on the video, you can all watch it on the Texas HHSC site, that the UT San Antonio program was really encouraging the moms to learn how to soothe the baby, but in so doing, they were soothing the moms too at a time when it is really tough. I mean, you get depressed and all that without even suffering from substance use disorder. So your body is wanting your escape from reality at a time when it's, you know, obviously contraindicated for the safety of the baby and all of that. So these programs are just ingenious. But I just wanted to say that smoking, having to quit smoking while breastfeeding is in and itself probably more difficult for a substance use disorder person who's suffering from substance use disorder. I want to let you guys know that, you know, though I'm not an expert, I am a person who is willing to speak the truth. And I think that's why Judge Martinez Jones and I get along so well, because she too is, I mean, to tell you, she is my shero, because she is a truth teller, a self-examiner, just always challenging herself and therefore me, because I learn from her every time. But a quote by John Wesley is something that I want to pass along. Do all the good you can by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can, is a motto that I strive, but of course fall short of, but I just want to pass that along.
That's awesome, Judge Wheelis. Well, I think that draws us to our conclusion. I just want to say thank you all so very much for having us. It was my pleasure to be here again, presenting with Judge Wheelis to this group. So thank you all.
Thank you, judges. We truly appreciate you participating in NAS Awareness Month here in Texas and help opening our eyes to all the good things that you're doing and how you're helping the moms and the babies. We truly appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody have a wonderful day.